The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant hills, casting a warm golden glow across the dusty country road. The air was heavy with the scent of dry grass and wild sage, carrying the faint sound of wind rustling through the scattered trees. The cowboy rode slowly, his horse's hooves crunching on the gravel, eyes scanning the horizon as he considered heading home before darkness fell. He was a man accustomed to solitude. His days were long, filled with tending cattle, repairing fences, and the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch. Yet despite his self-imposed isolation, he had a keen eye for anything out of place, honed by years of navigating the unforgiving land. It was that attentiveness that made him notice her. At first he thought it might be a scarecrow or a pile of debris beside a broken fence, but as he drew closer, the unmistakable shape of a human figure became clear. She was slumped against the weathered wood, small and fragile, her long hair tangled and streaked with dirt. As he reined his horse to a halt, the details became impossible to ignore. Her wrists bound roughly with rope, scratches along her arms, and clothes torn and muddied. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, turned toward him with wide, terrified eyes. The sight struck him like a physical blow. He dismounted quickly, boots crunching against the gravel, his mind racing with questions. Who had left her here? Why? And more importantly, could he just ride past and pretend he hadn't seen her? The cowboy was a practical man, used to assessing risk, but something in the girl's gaze pierced through the layers of caution he normally wore like armor. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only fear and a desperate plea for help she couldn't speak aloud. He approached carefully, speaking softly. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." His voice, calm but firm, seemed to reach her across the thin barrier of fear. The girl flinched but didn't cry out. She had probably learned that screams often brought more pain than help. Kneeling beside her, he inspected the rope binding her wrists. It was tight, chafing her skin, but he worked quickly, his hands steady, cutting the rope with a knife he carried at his belt. As soon as she was free, she rubbed her wrists, wincing but unable to hide a flicker of relief. She didn't speak, only shaking her head when he asked if anyone else had left her there. The cowboy glanced at the rundown farmhouse nearby, its windows dark and unwelcoming, and realized the answer: her father. The truth was almost too much to bear. Someone had left a young girl, barely 18, tied to a fence like she was nothing more than livestock, the result of drunken cruelty and neglect. His jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who liked children, nor did he usually involve himself in the affairs of others. But he couldn't just leave her to the night, to whatever danger might come. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. "You're coming with me. You'll be safe at my place." Her eyes searched his face, suspicion warring with hope. After a moment she hesitated, then nodded slowly. She had nowhere else to go, and she could sense the honesty in him. That single decision, the act of trusting a stranger, marked the first turning point in both their lives. As they walked toward his horse, the cowboy felt a sense of resolve settle over him. Tonight he would not be alone. Tonight he would have someone to protect. And though he didn't yet know it, the arrival of this frightened, abandoned girl would change his life as much as she had her own. The cowboy led her to his horse, offering her a hand up. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the darkening horizon where the dilapidated farmhouse lay, its crooked outline shadowed against the fading sun. The wind carried the faint stench of stale alcohol and rot, and she shivered, not just from the chill settling over the prairie, but from the memory of the fear that had kept her tied to that fence. Her fingers brushed against his as she accepted his help, tentative yet grateful, and for the first time since that morning, she felt a spark of hope. He mounted first, gesturing for her to climb behind him. She hesitated again, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. The cowboy waited patiently, saying nothing, allowing her the time she needed to trust him. Finally, she swung her leg over the horse and held on tightly, burying her face against his back to hide her trembling. He could feel the tension in her grip, her body rigid with fear and fatigue. He urged the horse forward at a slow, steady pace, the rhythmic clopping of hooves blending with the soft whistle of the evening breeze. Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe," he replied. His tone was firm but gentle, meant to reassure her without pushing too hard. "You don't have to worry about anyone tonight. No one's going to hurt you." She glanced over her shoulder at the farmhouse fading in the distance, her lips pressed tightly together. My father, she started, then swallowed hard, unwilling to speak the words aloud. The cowboy didn't press her. He knew enough to understand that the young girl had been abandoned and mistreated, left to fend for herself in a world that could be cruel and unrelenting. The journey to his ranch was quiet. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, painted in shades of gold and crimson by the setting sun. She had lived a life filled with neglect, hardship, and fear. But here, with the wind in her hair and the open land around her, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Freedom. Her mind replayed the terror of being tied to the fence. But now, in the presence of this quiet, steady man who had appeared out of nowhere to rescue her, those memories began to lose their weight. By the time they arrived at the ranch, darkness had settled fully over the land. The cowboy guided her down, helping her off the horse and leading her toward the warm glow of lantern light spilling from the small cabin. The smell of wood smoke and fresh food greeted her, a sharp contrast to the stench and decay she had left behind. She paused at the doorway, eyes wide, unsure if she was allowed to enter. "Go on," he said softly. "There's food and a bed waiting. You can rest." She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the simple but welcoming interior. A sturdy wooden table, a small fireplace crackling with warmth, and a bed neatly made with clean sheets. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel safe. She sank onto the edge of the bed, exhausted, relief and fear warring for dominance in her chest. The cowboy handed her a cup of warm water, his steady hands careful not to startle her. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just rest. I'll make sure nothing comes near you tonight." She nodded, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone, for the first time in her life, cared enough to protect her. That night she lay on the bed, listening to the wind rustling outside, feeling the steady presence of the cowboy nearby. The terror of her past seemed distant, like a shadow fading with the last light of day. And though she didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, she felt the first fragile glimmer of hope that perhaps, finally, things might begin to change. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in soft shades of pink and gold as the cowboy and the girl made their way deeper into the ranch. The land stretched endlessly, rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle and clusters of wildflowers swaying in the morning breeze. For the girl, it was a world unlike anything she had ever known, a place of quiet order and calm, where the chaos of her past seemed miles away. Her feet barely touched the dusty ground as they walked, and she instinctively stayed close to him, the memory of the rope still fresh on her wrists. As they approached the main cabin, the girl's eyes widened in awe. The building was modest but sturdy, its wooden walls weathered by the sun, smoke curling from the chimney into the crisp morning air. The porch, lined with barrels and tools, hinted at a life of hard work and self-sufficiency. The cowboy opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Hesitant, she stepped inside, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floorboards. Warmth enveloped her immediately, both from the crackling fire in the hearth and the unexpected feeling of safety. "Sit," he said gently, pointing to a chair by the table. "Eat something. You need strength." She lowered herself onto the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. On the table, a simple breakfast waited: fresh bread, thick slices of cheese, and a bowl of porridge steaming in the morning light. She stared at it, uncertain, as if she had never been offered food before without strings attached. The cowboy watched her silently, letting her take the lead. After a moment, she tentatively reached for the bread, taking a small bite. It was warm, soft, and nourishing, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. He took a seat across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said. "But I need to know your name." She hesitated, glancing at him, then whispered, "Lila." "Lila," he repeated, nodding. "That's a good name." There was a pause, the kind that felt full of unspoken understanding. Lila realized slowly that he wasn't there to judge her or question her past. He simply wanted to help, and for reasons she didn't yet understand, she felt she could trust him. After breakfast, he showed her around the ranch. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the sprawling land, the barn filled with animals, the corral where horses stamped their hooves, the fields stretching beyond the horizon. She had always longed for freedom, and here it was, laid out before her in golden sunlight and the smell of earth and hay. The cowboy explained the chores in a calm, measured voice, demonstrating how to feed the animals and mend fences. Lila listened carefully, absorbing every detail. For the first time, she felt capable, useful, and, most importantly, safe. By the end of the morning, a small but significant bond had begun to form. The cowboy observed Lila with quiet appreciation. She was fragile, yes, but also resilient, with a spark that had survived years of neglect. He realized that his responsibility extended beyond providing shelter. She needed guidance, patience, and someone who would stand by her no matter what. And though he rarely allowed himself to think of the future in personal terms, a small, unfamiliar warmth stirred in his chest, a hope that this encounter might be more than just a rescue. That evening, as the sun sank again behind the hills, Lila sat on the porch, watching the shadows lengthen across the fields. The world felt different now, bigger, safer, and more welcoming than anything she had ever known. The cowboy worked nearby, glancing at her occasionally, his presence steady and reassuring. In that quiet moment, the first threads of trust began to weave between them, fragile but undeniable. Lila knew her past could not be erased, but for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could belong, where someone would care for her simply because she mattered. Days passed on the ranch, each one blending into the next with a rhythm that was both comforting and new for Lila. The cowboy continued his work, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and maintaining the land with quiet diligence. Lila, at first hesitant and unsure, began to follow his lead, helping with the chores in small, careful ways. Feeding the chickens, carrying buckets of water, and gathering firewood gave her a sense of purpose she had never known. She discovered that she could be useful, that she could contribute, and with each small task completed, a sliver of pride began to grow in her chest. The cowboy observed her silently, never pushing, never forcing her to speak. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned, patiently, over time. And yet, in quiet moments, he allowed small gestures of kindness, a nod of approval, a soft word of encouragement, a hand held steady while she balanced on the horse for the first time. Each gesture, though seemingly minor, chipped away at the walls Lila had built around herself. She found herself beginning to relax in his presence, her laughter tentative but genuine, her gaze lingering longer than she intended. One afternoon, after a long morning of work, they sat together by the corral, watching the horses graze in the golden light. Lila finally spoke, her voice hesitant, fragile as glass. I never had anyone like you before. Someone who cares." Her eyes dropped to her hands, twisting them nervously. The cowboy didn't respond immediately, letting her words settle between them. Then he said softly but firmly, "You deserve someone who cares, Lila. Not everyone gets that, I know. But I do." There was no judgment in his voice, only quiet sincerity. Lila felt a warmth spread through her chest, the unfamiliar sensation of being valued, seen, and protected. As days turned into weeks, their routine became a dance of mutual understanding. The cowboy would work, and Lila would assist, but their interactions were sprinkled with moments of laughter and small discoveries. She would teach him things about the world beyond the ranch, stories of the town she had briefly known, memories of childhood dreams she had long abandoned. In return, he shared fragments of his own life, carefully chosen pieces that hinted at loneliness and loss, but also at resilience. Through these exchanges, trust grew like the slow, steady growth of grass after a spring rain, strong yet delicate, requiring care and attention. At night, they would sit by the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in Lila's eyes, her expression softening each evening. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or the sound of raised voices. She allowed herself to be present in the moment, to rest, to feel safe. The cowboy noticed the subtle changes, the way she moved with a bit more confidence, how her smiles lingered, how her laughter no longer felt forced. It was a transformation not just of circumstance, but of spirit. Yet beneath the growing bond, both felt the lingering shadow of uncertainty. Lila's past could never be fully erased. She had been shaped by neglect and fear, and the cowboy, though steady and protective, carried his own scars of isolation and hardship. Still, they continued forward, step by careful step, learning that trust was not a single act but a series of shared experiences, each one binding them closer. By the end of the 4th week, a quiet understanding had been established. Lila no longer viewed the cowboy solely as a protector. He was a companion, a guide, and a safe harbor in a world that had been harsh and unforgiving. And the cowboy, who had long been content in solitude, began to realize that perhaps he no longer wanted to be alone. Together they were building something fragile yet profound, the beginnings of trust, respect, and a bond that neither could have anticipated when the girl had first been tied to that fence. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and livestock, when the cowboy noticed a cloud of dust rising on the horizon. At first he thought it was a rider coming through the prairie as usual, neighbors, merchants, or travelers, but as the figure grew closer, his chest tightened with unease. It was a man, staggering slightly in the saddle, reeking of alcohol. And as he drew nearer, the cowboy recognized the face from Lila's fearful descriptions, her father. The cowboy felt a surge of protectiveness and anger. He had expected challenges in taking Lila in, but he hadn't anticipated a confrontation so soon. He guided Lila quietly behind the barn, keeping her out of sight. Her eyes widened in terror as she recognized the man, trembling as the memory of the rope and her father's drunken cruelty returned in full force. She clutched the cowboy's arm, her body rigid with fear. The father reined his horse abruptly, shouting across the yard, slurred words carried by the wind. "Give me back my girl." His voice was rough and commanding, filled with entitlement and menace. The cowboy stepped forward calmly, placing himself between Lila and her father, his posture firm and unyielding. "You're not taking her anywhere," the cowboy said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of authority. "She's not yours to treat like property. She's under my care now, and I won't let anyone harm her." The father sneered, taking a swig from a bottle he had been holding, his eyes glassy with intoxication. "I'll do what I want. She's mine." He spurred his horse closer, but the cowboy didn't flinch. Years of working the land had honed his instincts. He knew how to assert control without escalating unnecessary danger. His hands rested near the holster of his sidearm, a subtle reminder that he was not defenseless. Lila's fear was palpable. She whispered, "Please, make him go away." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I've got you, Lila. Stay behind me." The confrontation was tense, the silence punctuated only by the occasional neigh of a horse or the rustle of wind through the grass. The father's bravado faltered as he realized the cowboy would not yield. He sneered one last time, swaying slightly in the saddle, before finally spurring his horse and retreating down the dirt road, disappearing into the distance. The cowboy let out a slow breath, the tension leaving his body in stages. He turned to Lila, seeing the relief flooding her face, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in weeks. "You're safe now," he said softly. "No one's going to tie you up or hurt you again." Lila's voice trembled, but she managed a whisper. "Thank you for protecting me." Her eyes glistened with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude and trust. The cowboy nodded, saying nothing more than necessary, letting his actions speak louder than words. That day, the ranch felt different. The air, once heavy with the threat of her past, seemed lighter, filled with the quiet reassurance of safety. The cowboy worked side by side with Lila, reinforcing fences and caring for the animals, each gesture reinforcing the bond they had begun to form. She followed his lead without hesitation, her confidence growing with every completed task, her fear gradually replaced by a cautious sense of empowerment. By nightfall, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the velvet sky. Lila leaned slightly against the cowboy, her trust now anchored in both his protection and his unwavering presence. He glanced at her, recognizing the resilience forming within her, a strength born of survival, tempered by the kindness and steadiness he provided. The encounter with her father had tested them both, but it had also solidified something unspoken. Lila was no longer alone, and neither was he. The cowboy had stepped into the role of protector, mentor, and companion, and in doing so, had begun to forge a foundation of trust, safety, and something deeper, something neither had fully acknowledged yet, an emotional bond that would only grow stronger with time. The days on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm, each one bringing small victories and subtle joys that neither the cowboy nor Lila had expected. The morning sun spilled across the fields as they moved together through the chores, feeding the livestock, mending fences, and tending to the horses. Lila had grown stronger, her movements more confident, her hands steady as she carried buckets of water or guided a restless colt. Each task completed gave her a tangible sense of accomplishment, a feeling she had never truly known in her previous life, where fear and neglect had defined every day. The cowboy observed quietly, noting the way her shoulders relaxed with each successful task, the way her laughter began to ring out, soft but genuine, as she worked. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but he offered small words of encouragement and correction when needed, letting her learn while always being close enough to step in if danger arose. Slowly, he began to see her not just as someone he needed to protect, but as someone capable, resilient, and intelligent, a young woman who had endured far too much but had refused to break. One afternoon, after finishing chores, the cowboy led Lila to the corral to work with the horses. A young, skittish mare needed gentle guidance, and he showed Lila how to approach it with patience rather than force. At first, her movements were hesitant, her fear of failure evident. But as the mare began to respond, her face lit up with a mixture of pride and relief. The cowboy watched silently, heart quietly swelling. She was learning to trust herself, to trust him, and to embrace a world where she could thrive instead of merely survive. Evenings became their quiet sanctuary. After the animals were fed and the fences repaired, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories and observations from the day. Lila began opening up about small, treasured memories of her childhood, moments that had survived the hardship and neglect. She spoke of dreams she had long abandoned, the hope of a life where she was safe, valued, and free to make choices. The cowboy listened, never interrupting, never judging, only offering occasional comments that encouraged reflection and confidence. In these moments, a profound trust developed, a sense that they could be honest and vulnerable with each other without fear. There were also moments of subtle, playful teasing. The cowboy would challenge her to ride a horse across the field, pretending to falter so she could demonstrate her growing skill. She would laugh, mock exasperated, her eyes shining with delight, and he would smile quietly, pleased to see her reclaiming pieces of herself that had long been buried under fear and uncertainty. These small joys became milestones in her healing, a visible transformation from the frightened, fragile girl he had found tied to a fence. As the weeks passed, the ranch itself became a symbol of stability and security. The once distant horizon no longer felt like a reminder of an uncertain past, but a canvas for potential and growth. Lila began taking initiative, helping organize chores, caring for the animals with a gentle efficiency, and even suggesting improvements to routines. The cowboy, once solitary and content with his own company, found unexpected satisfaction in her presence. In the subtle ways she brightened the ranch and softened the solitude he had always embraced. By the end of this chapter in their lives, healing had taken root in both of them. Lila's fears had not vanished entirely, but they were overshadowed by confidence, trust, and the reassurance of protection. The cowboy's once lonely existence was now shared with someone who had earned his respect and admiration, someone whose resilience inspired him in ways he had never imagined. Together, they were more than just protector and protected. They were companions forging a shared life, a tentative but powerful bond built on trust, patience, and the quiet strength of mutual care. The evening sky was painted in deep purples and fiery oranges as the cowboy and Lila worked side by side in the fields, tending to the last of the day's chores. A gentle breeze carried the scent of hay and wildflowers, and for a moment the world felt suspended, the chaos of the past reduced to a distant memory. Lila had grown into her surroundings, her confidence evident in the way she moved, the way she handled the animals, and the way her laughter now rang freely across the open land. But even with her newfound strength, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that softened when they met the cowboy's, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. As the sun dipped lower, Casting long shadows across the prairie, Lila paused to rest on a fence post. She watched the cowboy adjust the ropes on a stubborn calf, his movements deliberate and practiced. There was a calm assurance about him, a steadiness that had become her anchor. She had spent so long in fear, in uncertainty, that this sense of security was almost disorienting. But it was also exhilarating. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel not just safe, but deeply cared for. The cowboy noticed her pause and walked over, leaning casually against the fence. "You've done well today," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "I can tell you've been paying attention." Lila's cheeks flushed and she looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. I've never really been good at anything before," she admitted softly. "Everything I did just fell apart." She paused, then added, almost as a whisper, "But you make me feel like I can do it." "Like I matter." The cowboy's expression softened. He had seen many people in his life, but none had stirred him quite like Lila. Her honesty, her resilience, and the fragile hope she carried were all things he had come to protect. Yes, but also things he had come to admire. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his eyes steady and sincere. "You do matter, Lila," he said. "More than you realize. You've got strength in you I haven't seen in anyone else." Her heart thudded in her chest, and she felt warmth spreading through her in a way that was both comforting and frightening. She wanted to say more, to explain the depth of her gratitude, but words failed her. The cowboy didn't rush her, didn't need her to speak. Instead, he reached out, lightly brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and filled with unspoken meaning. For the first time, Lila allowed herself to see the man not just as her protector, but as someone who cared for her deeply, someone whose presence had become as vital to her as the air she breathed. And in that same instant, she realized that the cowboy had allowed himself to care in a way he had not done for years. His life, once defined by solitude and routine, had been transformed by her presence, by her trust, and by the bond they had cultivated together. The moment stretched, charged with emotion neither had yet dared to name. Lila finally whispered, I don't know what I'd do without you." The cowboy's gaze softened further, and he let a small, rare smile touch his lips. "You don't have to ever find out," he replied, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere, Lila, not now, not ever." For the first time, they allowed themselves to acknowledge the feelings that had been building beneath the surface, the gratitude, the trust, the admiration, and the hint of something more profound, something that could grow into love if nurtured carefully. That night, as they watched the stars emerge one by one over the quiet prairie, the emotional confession lingered between them, unspoken yet fully understood. Their bond had deepened, solidified by trust, shared experience, and the quiet acknowledgement that they had become essential to each other's lives in ways neither could ignore. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, vast and open, much like the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time, both Lila and the cowboy allowed themselves to imagine a future together, one built not on fear or obligation, but on mutual care, respect, and the fragile, exhilarating beginnings of love. The morning sun rose slowly over the ranch, spilling golden light across the fields and glinting off the dew-kissed grass. The air was alive with the soft sounds of life, birds calling, horses whinnying, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Lila stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging. This land, once foreign and intimidating, now felt like home, filled with the safety, purpose, and quiet beauty she had longed for but never known. The cowboy emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth and giving her a nod of acknowledgement. "Morning," he said simply, his voice carrying the ease of familiarity. No formality was needed here. Their relationship had grown beyond mere courtesy into something steady and enduring. Lila smiled, feeling the bond between them in a way that was tangible, a comfort that went beyond words. The ranch was alive with activity. Horses needed feeding, fences needed mending, and the daily tasks that had once seemed burdensome now felt meaningful. Lila moved with confidence, guiding a young colt into the corral, her hands steady, her movements sure. The cowboy watched from a distance, pride swelling quietly in his chest. She had grown strong, resilient, and capable, not just in body but in spirit. She had reclaimed herself from a past defined by neglect, and in doing so, had become a part of something greater than herself. After the chores, they sat together on the porch, sipping warm coffee and enjoying the peace that came with shared silence. There was comfort in their presence together, a mutual understanding that needed no words. Lila reached out and brushed her fingers across the cowboy's hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Gratitude, trust, and the quiet acknowledgement of a bond that had evolved into love. He didn't pull away. Instead, he intertwined their fingers, letting the gesture linger. It was a promise without words, a vow of care, protection, and partnership. The days continued in their steady rhythm, each one reinforcing their connection. Lila explored her surroundings, taking joy in the simple pleasures of ranch life, tending to the animals, feeling the soil beneath her boots, riding across the open prairie. The cowboy, once content with solitude, found himself invigorated by her presence, her laughter, and the life she breathed into the ranch. Their companionship had grown into something profound, a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and the shared experience of overcoming hardship. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they stood together at the edge of the pasture. Lila looked out over the land, a sense of awe and contentment in her gaze. "I never thought I'd feel happy," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." "Not really." The cowboy placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying and reassuring. "You deserve it, Lila," he said gently. "You deserve to feel safe, to feel valued, to feel like you belong somewhere." She leaned slightly into him, the weight of her past easing with each shared moment, each affirmation of trust and care. As night fell and stars began to shimmer in the wide prairie sky, they retreated to the porch, wrapped in blankets and the quiet serenity of the ranch. Lila's past no longer held the power to define her future. The cowboy's steadfast presence had transformed fear into safety, despair into hope, and loneliness into companionship. Together they had built a life where trust and love could flourish, a life rooted in second chances and the promise of tomorrow. The ranch, once a simple place of work and isolation, had become a home filled with laughter, care, and mutual devotion. And as the night deepened, both Lila and the cowboy understood without words that this was only the beginning. Their lives, forever intertwined, stretched out ahead like the endless prairie, filled with possibility, healing, and the quiet joy of a love forged through trials and tempered by trust.